everybody, and welcome to Project HR, a podcast dedicated to building better workplaces. I'm Jennifer Oraqua, COO of Projections, and your host. Now, as we approach the one-year mark since COVID-19 came into our lives, change has been the one constant. Just as we've all made adjustments personally in the way we live, work, and shop, employers have had to make accommodations in the ways that work gets done to help keep employees safe and keep their businesses going. Labor unions are no exception. Organized labor has had to adapt the way in which they conduct business. You might wonder what their adaptations mean for companies like yours. Today, I'm joined by David Pryzbylski, partner with Barnes and Thornburg. David focuses his practice on labor and employment, and he's got some outstanding insight on how the pandemic has affected labor law. David, we're so happy to have you on Project HR.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm really happy to be here.
So first, in terms of labor relations, how has COVID impacted the landscape? And I want to first talk about employers with represented employees, and then I'd love to talk about also non-union employers.
Absolutely. So we'll start with the represented employers first. So those companies who are already represented by unions and dealing with unionized workforces, just like every other employer in America, they were seeing a lot of activity when the pandemic started to hit in March going into April, but probably even more so than their non-union counterparts. They had another layer of nuance to deal with because they had the unions who they had to negotiate potential changes to their members' terms and conditions of employment.
Mm-hmm.
When the pandemic hit and employers were scrambling to issue new leave policies in accordance with the legislation that was coming out, or revise attendance policies or leave policies to accommodate people who might have an unexpected need for leave. So, for example, when the schools were shut down, all those things potentially are things that have to be bargained with a union before an employer can unilaterally do those.
Mm-hmm.
So, in addition to trying to act fast and figure things out, they also had to make sure they were honoring any legal obligation they may have had in terms of dealing with their union. So I think that for pretty much every employer in March going into April was something that was taking up a lot of time, I would say. On the non-union employer front, it's been interesting when we've seen companies targeted by unions to organize their employees. Obviously, pre-pandemic, the way companies often conducted union-free campaigns, and Projections obviously has a vast experience with this. And I would actually Projections was out ahead of most of other people in that space because a lot of what Projections does, right, is you do the online communications and the video communications in addition to others. But during the pandemic, while that was always an avenue in terms of virtual communications that many employers utilize, it's really become imperative at this point, right? Because pre-pandemic, a lot of times a non-union employer might try to get 50, 100, 200 employees in a room together and have the CEO or head of HR give an address to the company and the employees about unionization. Well, in the era of social distancing, even if you could legally do it based on your state's stay-at-home orders and those types of things, you got to question whether or not it's actually a smart idea because you might rub people the wrong way by having them sit shoulder to shoulder to listen to the company. So it's impacting the way non-union employers potentially get to confront and communicate around unionization issues as well. So as with every other dynamic in the workplace, COVID-19 has significantly upended labor relations.
For sure. Yeah. And we'll get into mail-in ballots in a little bit later on. What are some strategies that companies can actually use to implement changes in the workplace related to COVID?
So the first step for me always is looking at the labor agreement. If you have a union and a collective bargaining agreement, the first thing an employer wants to do is look to see if you have a provision or provisions within that agreement that allow you to take the action you want to take. In the absence of that, I think the best play is to go ahead and put the union on notice of the changes you're wanting to seek. I've actually been very surprised since COVID hit the cooperation I've seen from unions across virtually every industry. Being sensitive to the fact that companies, by and large, are trying to do the right thing. They are trying to operate safely, and at the same time, they are trying to ensure their operations can continue so they can continue to make money and employ the union members. So I think engaging the union, being proactive, and being upfront with them about actions you intend to take, even if it's action that's permitted by the labor agreement, by the way. From a relationship perspective, I think you can get a lot of goodwill by keeping the union abreast of the changes you're looking to implement. And that can have a lot of benefit as well, because to the extent you're afraid you're going to get grievances and being tied up in arbitration, even if you think you're going to win, I think having the union buy in on the front end can often be very beneficial.
And it's interesting because I wrote an article for our blog very early on in the process, and I interviewed a number of our clients, and they were talking about how their unions, those represented employers, the unions were actually really cooperative and really helpful, and actually one of their greatest assets during the time of uncertainty. So I was kind of wondering what kind of bargaining requests are you actually seeing from unions at this point?
So going back to March into April, I was seeing different requests than I'm seeing now. So back at the beginning of the pandemic, I was seeing a lot of requests, particularly in the hospitality and healthcare sectors, for things like hazard pay, expanded leave,
Mhm.
revised attendance policies or attendance forgiveness of some way, shape, or form, particularly in communities where the schools are being shut down and those types of things. As things have gone on, I'm starting to see a lot more requests about PPE and those types of things as the pandemic has continued to draw out. So I'm seeing a lot of different requests in a lot of different categories, and some of it's tied to the industries. So in healthcare, PPE is a big one, and in manufacturing, attendance forgiveness and those types of things has been a common theme I've seen there. But it really runs the gamut of all the different things you can see from an employment policy and leave entitlement perspective.
Interesting. So, unions often request different information from companies related to their members in terms of terms and conditions of employment. Has COVID impacted this at all?
Absolutely. So, a lot of unions have been requesting information on the policies we're implementing to the extent the companies are affected by the legislation that was passed for expanded leave and leave pay for certain types of absences while employees are away from work. Also, seen a lot of requests from unions to be contacted with information about employees who have tested or been deemed presumptively positive in the workplace. So, they have actually asked many of my clients, can you please let us know anytime one of our members tests positive? Don't
Hmm.
necessarily want to know the name, but want to have the same information you would communicate to other people who would need to be contacted for a potential quarantine order. So shift, location, etc. So non-identifiable information. Another thing I've seen related to those requests is what's called standing requests. So unions oftentimes will say, hey, anytime this happens, so anytime you have an employee test positive or deemed presumptively positive for COVID, we'd like to be informed. Those requests can be a little annoying, to say the least. They can be kind of burdensome. So, oftentimes, what I recommend to companies when they get those standing requests, regardless of what they're ultimately seeking, is come up with an agreement with the union in terms of how often you're going to provide that information. So, maybe it's once a month. You're going to update them on the first Monday of every month with any relevant updates that have happened in the prior 30 days. Under the National Labor Relations Act, employers have a duty, a legal obligation to respond to standing requests. You can't just say, hey, you need to renew this request every 2 weeks or something like that. But what you can do again is come up with some type of agreement with the union to accommodate a request response schedule that works for you and makes the most sense for your organization.
Going one step further with that, what are some actual strategies that unionized employers can use to deal with and manage these information requests? You mentioned a few things, but what else can they do to deal with the maybe the volume of information requests that might be coming at them at this point?
Absolutely. Well, my first number one tip with information requests is always memorialize your responses in writing. Even if it is a verbal response that you give the union, I always recommend to follow up with an email. It's always easy to respond to an unfair labor practice charge alleging we've somehow failed to respond to an information request if we can attach as an exhibit to our unfair labor practice response the email or the written communication showing that we responded. In addition, as we were talking about bargaining and keeping union abreast of what's going on and getting their buy-in on the front end, that's also important with information requests. In my experience, and I think as you mentioned, Jennifer, and what you've seen in some blog posts and other places, unions have been cooperative throughout this process. And the instances where I've seen them be a little bit more standoffish is where companies are not trying to share information about their members, right? You don't have to give away the keys to the kingdom. You don't have to open up your financial books or anything like that. But when it comes to what you are doing for your workers, their members, if you can get their buy-in and show them you're doing the right thing, that oftentimes will allow them to be easier to work with when it comes to things like information requests.
I love it. So set expectations, document, document, document. Has the NLRB issued any guidance for employers on bargaining obligations related to the pandemic?
Yeah, Peter Robb issued a memo in March of this year that said employers should be privileged in emergency circumstances to take unilateral action, with the caveat that if they take the unilateral action, they have an ongoing duty to still sit down with the union and talk about the changes that were made and potential alternatives to those changes going forward. You know, it was interesting because that March memo, because I think the last major pandemic, Spanish flu, predates the 1935 enactment of the National Relations Act. So there wasn't a
Mhm.
whole pandemic labor law
Right.
precedent, right? So he actually cited cases in that memo that dealt with things like the 9/11 travesty and how certain retailers had an unexpected drop off in business right after that and needed to implement layoffs immediately. They couldn't wait because of that unexpected decline in business. He also cited some case law dealing with bargaining obligations post natural disasters like a hurricane, the potential exigent need for an employer to lay off employees after an unexpected loss to company property or things along those lines. Now, it's interesting on the National Labor Relations Board website. A lot of people don't know this, but you can actually look at advice memorandums that have been issued by the NLRB, General Counsel's Office, to the various regions across the country.
Mhm.
And in these memos, what happens is the General Counsel's Office, or the top lawyer at the NLRB, examines different cases that have been filed with the various regions. And the General Counsel's Office offers advice to the regions in terms of whether or not they think a violation of the NLRA has been found. Peter Robb's done a good job in the last few years of publishing these memos monthly on the website. So you can actually go on, if you go under their guidance tab and click on advice memos, you can drill down to advice memos. In the last 2 months, he's released a lot of memos that deal with things like COVID.
So, going back a little bit to actual bargaining sessions, I've talked with so many company representatives who are thoroughly frustrated by the impact the pandemic has had on the actual ability to bargain. What have you seen? How has COVID impacted negotiations from a logistics perspective? By
Oh, it's
Zoom
been
or
no, absolutely. It's been a crazy year. I'll say that.
yeah.
A lot of my negotiations that were scheduled for April and May got punted. So, I had some we extended like by a month or two to see things were. I had others that extended for a full year. And I had others where the union or one of the parties was interested in Zoom and others weren't. So, I'd say between March and May, I engaged in very little contract bargaining with unions. I had some negotiations over discrete items that were being implemented due to COVID, but in terms of true successor contract negotiations, a lot of them were punted. Since about June, I personally have been doing all my labor agreement negotiations for the most part in person. Most of my clients have come to the conclusion that reading body language across the table, being able to make those connections and hear people's thoughts on proposals that are being exchanged across the table is important. And you can't really pick up on all those subtle cues on Zoom or WebEx or any of these other virtual platforms that you can in person. There might be some circumstances where if you really need to get a contract, people aren't comfortable meeting in person, then if you have to go by Zoom, you absolutely can. I have some clients in, the paper industry or the steel industry where there's big master agreements for those companies. And you have the local one-offs that are really just a few discrete parts, but pretty much everything's hashed out because the master's taking care of that, right?
Mhm.
But those are circumstances where maybe a Zoom negotiation is fine. But I think it's been a challenge. I think it's been a headache. I have a lot of clients who have been frustrated, who want to get to the table in person, and unions don't feel comfortable. And look, at some point, you can't fault people for not feeling comfortable. But in my experience, we have been able to do in person negotiations in bigger rooms with more tables, more spread out, ensuring distancing is being followed. So I think there is an avenue to get that done. But everybody has to be a little bit more flexible right now, I think, in the current environment.
All right, David, now that our listeners understand the pandemic's legal impact on their businesses, we're going to take a quick sponsorship break. But when we return, I want to talk more about the impact of the pandemic on organizing and preventive efforts. So stay with us.
Hi, thanks for listening. And also thanks to Proofbox for supporting this week's episode of Project HR. Proofbox is like Netflix for labor relations. Every video, every resource, immediately at your fingertips. Instantly stream the employee communication titles you need and allow members of your leadership team to do the same. Learn more at unionproof.com/proofbox.
We're back with David Pryzbylski, partner at Barnes and Thornburg, specializing in labor and employment. So, David, do unions have the right to inspect work facilities for health and safety issues under COVID?
Interesting question, Jennifer. So, a lot of unions actually will have provisions in their labor agreements with companies that allow them access to the facility upon request. And there's usually some parameters around how often they can show up, who can be there, etc. So, if your company has such a provision in your labor agreement, My general answer would be, well, you're going to have to abide by that provision, even during COVID. Now, if you have a facility that's had a large outbreak and you can show a need not to allow external people into the facility, I think that's one where you might be able to push back or at least broker some type of accommodation with the union to limit the amount of people who can come in and at what times. But if you have that provision in your labor agreement, I think it's going to be difficult for you to get around. Even in the absence of such a provision in a labor agreement, the National Relations Board has generally said unions should be allowed some access to the working sites of their members. So if you get a request from a union to come on site, I would be very hesitant to flat out say, no way, no how are you coming to our facility. Now, again, if you have a particular concern about people being in the site due to a COVID outbreak or due to other social distancing measures and policies you've been implementing, I think you can have discussions with the union about those concerns, potentially satisfy their request to be there on some other basis. Maybe it's a virtual Zoom tour, since we're seeing a lot of things being done by Zoom and virtually these days. I'm not sure, but I would be hesitant to not at least go through the process and through the discussions with the union about their concerns, what they want to see, and what they want to have accomplished, and figuring out a way to get that done.
Well, and I think we kind of know the answer to this, but have those workplace safety concerns led to increased organizing?
Yeah, we've definitely seen increased organizing. Now, the number of petitions, formal petitions, which is once a union gets sufficient amount of interest among a particular employee group, they can go ahead and file a petition with the National Relations Board to have a union election. We haven't seen a significant uptick in actual petitions being filed yet. But what I would tell you is we are seeing an unprecedented amount in the last 3 months of interest of union organizing. So we're definitely seeing a lot of interest. I think the petitions are lagging a little bit behind the interest we're seeing. So I would say in Q1 of next year, we'll probably see a large uptick in the amount of petitions we're actually seeing being filed with the NLRB for union elections.
Yeah, I totally agree with you that that's a lagging indicator for sure. How has the pandemic affected union elections other than, they're not necessarily filing the petitions, they're just sort of garnering interest. Have you seen any other changes to union elections during the pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you mentioned this briefly earlier, Jennifer. So one of the things is the way union elections are conducted. So once that election is scheduled, how it worked pre-pandemic is a board agent or maybe a couple board agents, depending on the side of the unit, would come out to the facility and they have a little briefcase thing that folds out and turns into a little private voting booth with a curtain. They hold an election. Employees walk into the voting booth one by one and they put yes for the union or no, I don't want the union. After that election is done, the board agent sits there and they count out the ballots and they let you know right then and there, generally speaking, if the union gets in or not. Now, for the union to get in, they need 50% plus one employee of those who are actually voting to get in. So if you have a unit of 100 employees, but only 30 people show up to vote, if 16 employees of the 30 vote for the union, then the union comes in. Now, a tie in those circumstances goes to the employer. The beautiful thing about a live election like that, when an employee is in the voting booth, he or she is the only person who ever will know how they actually cast his or her ballot. There's no identifiable information on the ballots. They don't have to sign their name or anything like that. So they have absolute free and private choice in the voting booth. What we've seen since the pandemic is we've seen a drastic increase in mail-in ballots. This is where the NLRB mails out ballots to people in the bargaining unit. So rather than a board agent come out to the site, the board would send all those workers ballots in the mail, and they would ask for them to be sent and postmarked back to the NLRB by a certain date. And then the board would get all those ballots, and they would count them out once they've all come in, and that's how you get the vote count. The problem with this is if an employee gets a ballot at his or her home, well, you don't know what's happening to that employee as he or she is filling out that ballot. They might have a union organizer in their kitchen talking to them about this issue, peer pressuring them, browbeating them into voting for the union. We don't actually know what is happening when they get the ballots at home. And we don't know how they're being impacted or whether or not that's impacting the way they're ultimately voting in the election. Now, since the beginning of this year, with all the mail ballot elections that have happened, unions are winning about 72% of those. That's slightly better than what they were winning in live elections, which was about 70% or so. So we haven't seen a huge increase in terms of the actual outcome. But I can tell you, based on personal experience, particularly stories you hear from the tactics unions employ to get people to sign cards in the first place, I do think the shift to mail in ballots is problematic. And I do think it potentially does not or is not conducive to employee free choice when it comes to actually voting for or against the union.
Interesting. Yeah, we had an interesting case that we worked on just recently, and it was, of course, mail-in. And the challenge was is that a lot of the those in the bargaining unit, the proposed bargaining unit, were very young, so they actually had not used the mail before. They didn't know where to get a stamp. They didn't know where to mail it. They didn't. Some of them lived at home with their parents, so their parents got the mail instead of them. So they didn't actually get the mail on a daily basis. So they didn't know to watch for their ballot. And so all of those challenges, we produced a video for them on here's how you actually do it. This is what the ballot looks like. This is what you can expect. The dates at which there's the window that's very specific on when they have to mail it in. So yeah, so I agree with you that it is definitely problematic.
I like that. Projections always makes great videos. So that's really fascinating to hear that you actually put a step-by-step process for the mail. It's kind of like a landline, right? It's really not shocking to me, I suppose, now that you say that you
Yeah.
had a young workforce who didn't know how to use the mail, and it'd be just a similar outcome I would envision if somebody said you have to go use a landline for something or a fax machine.
Right. Go fax that to me. Yeah, exactly. Well, one of the other things that we talked about with them was turnout, making sure that we got the turnout, and that did help turn out the vote because people had the confidence to actually cast their ballot. Is there anything else you can touch on about how the mail-in balloting kind of compares to a normal election? What strategic and legal considerations are implicated by the whole mail-in voting?
Yeah, I don't know if it's specific to the mail-in voting necessarily, but it is related. I think it's something we touched on at the beginning. I think the way employers have to communicate to employees just has to be different now.
Hmm.
So pre-pandemic, I had a lot of clients use materials like videos, websites, and things like projections puts on as a supplement to the in-person communication. So
Hmm.
the one-on-one conversations with the supervisors to the workers, the group meetings with a shift manager, department manager, or CEO of the organization with large groups of employees. And having those daily shift meetings as well, where supervisors are communicating to the workers in person and semi large or very large groups of workers at once. I think now again the importance on doing things like videos, having a website, sending out well crafted emails is paramount because now I think even if you could satisfy yourself legally, it's okay to get all these people together. My concern would be getting people together in large groups, maybe not as socially distanced as they feel comfortable. Regardless
Hmm.
of what you have to say, they're going to be turned off from the outset by virtue of the fact you're potentially, at least in their perception, being put in danger of being in close proximity to other people. So I think the way we communicate about unionization and why we think as a company, our employees and our company is better off without a union has changed dramatically. And I think, in addition, you talked about the younger workforce, right? And it's not just mail in voting. The way people communicate these days, I think, is changing as we look to the generation behind us. They feel a lot more comfortable, even pre pandemic, communicating electronically. So I think this is something employers will have to give more and more thought to in the coming years or coming months for that matter, in terms of how they communicate during this type of process.
Well, and even the NLRB may need to consider. I mean, if you can sign an authorization card online, why can't you vote online? I mean, I think that employees are going to start looking at it and asking, why can't we make this a simpler process? So that'll be interesting to watch and keep an eye on.
Absolutely.
So we've definitely seen an increase in union-led demonstrations and protests. You alluded to it as far as organizing activity. What can unionized businesses do to discourage strike action during the pandemic?
So that's a tough one. We've seen uptick in strikes. As a quick caveat, on a related note, there have actually been zero lockouts initiated by employers since the start of
I
2020.
saw that. Yeah.
Yeah, the employer's corollary right to a strike, you can lock out your workforce until they accept your contract demands. We've actually seen none in 2020. So, but we have seen an uptick in strikes. And I think usually the best way to stave off a strike is to get buy-in at the table, which kind of ties back into what we were talking about with COVID-19 and emergency changes at the beginning, as well as information requests. Look, I think a lot of unions were expecting, rightfully so, bad news at the table. And I think if you can effectively communicate and explain why the news is bad, 9 times out of 10, that's going to land you in an okay spot, even if it's not a spot the union wants to be. But if you go in and you're slamming the table and yelling at the other side, and you just need to
Mhm.
realize that this is the way things are right now, well, that's probably not going to be conducive to a circumstance where employees and the union are going to recognize the challenges in front of you and not cause them to do something drastic like walk off. So to me, it's getting the buy-in, communicating, explaining. Again, you have to give away the keys to the kingdom. You have to open up every single financial record of the company. But what you do need to do is impress upon them and the workers about why you're proposing what you're proposing and get the buy-in from them.
Yeah, agree wholeheartedly. Yeah, that's one thing that we help with a lot is folks who are involved in negotiations, putting out a website to communicate with employees and get that, make that business case, get that buy-in throughout the process, so that when it comes time for ratification, it's a breeze, and you're not really fighting at that point. So,
Absolutely. And one other thing I've done in a lot of my negotiations this year is I've had the CEO or somebody akin to a CEO come in at the very beginning of negotiations. I never like that person to spend a lot of time with the union because I don't want him or her to be peppered with questions and be put on the spot. But what I have done in almost all my negotiations this year is have them come in, usually before we get to economics, and give a very genuine and wholehearted thank you to the workforce about everything they've been doing, everything they've been contributing, all the
mhm.
sacrifices they've all been making for the company. Even if the company hasn't been doing great, it really hasn't been through any fault of the employees, right? It was the unforeseen business circumstances. But I think that's another way to hit a high note with the workers, just showing that appreciation for them and making sure they know that the company appreciates it going into negotiations.
For sure. So I wanted to just briefly touch on some of the loan programs that were available for mid-sized companies under the CARES Act that came with some strings attached. And we cautioned our clients on this, and I'm sure you did as well, requiring businesses to remain neutral regarding any union organizing during the term of the loan. Can you talk a little bit about what that means and what employers need to know at this point?
Yeah, that was a fascinating one. I think that was one of the things that got buried in some of the fine print of all this legislation.
Hmm.
So, yeah, it applies to employers between 500 and 10,000 workers, so a fair amount of companies around the country. If you have between 500 and 10,000 workers and you took out a loan under the CARES Act, there's two labor law requirements. One is the one you mentioned, that you have to remain neutral in any union campaign that happens during the term of the loan. So if you took out a 3-year loan under the CARES Act and you're within the employer threshold, you have to remain neutral if you get hit with a union petition or if you have any union organizing. What that means is, let me back up for a second. We're not exactly sure what that means because the Department of Treasury, not the National Relations Board, the Department of Treasury, so as far as I can tell, doesn't have any complex, sophisticated labor relations experience. Why would they, right? It's the Department of Treasury. They're the ones that are supposed to put out guidance and regulations on this. They have not yet done so for this particular aspect. But historically, when an employer is to remain neutral during a union campaign, what that means is they can't talk negatively about the union. They can't encourage their employees to not sign up for the union. They really just have to sit idly by and let the union do its thing. And hopefully, from the union's perspective, get enough people signed up and ultimately vote yes for the union in an election. So if being union free is important to you and you have one of these loans out, I think you need to give a lot of thought in terms of how to be proactive so you don't have any union interest. So, working with somebody like Projections or myself or somebody else who does positive employee relations coaching,
Hmm.
it's imperative to make sure your employees don't feel like they need to go out and get a third party advocate for them because you're already doing all the things they want to see be done. Now, there is a second requirement for employers who have unions and have collective bargaining agreements. If they took out a loan under the CARES Act, same threshold between 500 and 10,000, they cannot what's called abrogate the collective bargaining agreement for the duration of the loan plus 2 years. Don't know what abrogate means. Does that mean, hey, I took a unilateral action, union filed a grievance, I lost the arbitration, the arbitrator said I exceeded the bounds of my authority? Does that mean I've abrogated my collective bargaining agreement? I don't know. Sounds like it could mean that, in which case you have to immediately repay the outstanding balance of the loan, which isn't great. And that's still guidance that we're waiting from the Department of Treasury. Again, Department of Treasury, not the National Relations Board, who's coming out with this guidance. But I would give a lot of thought if you fall in that category and have one of those outstanding as to what this potentially means for you, and to track that as you're going through to make sure you don't have any unintended negative consequences
Crazy. Employers definitely need somebody like you on their side. All
from
right, David, we're going to take some time out for another quick break, and we'll be right back after this. You're listening to the Project HR podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Oraqua, and our guest today is David Pryzbylski, partner with Barnes and Thornburg, specializing in labor and employment. We are back. What legal changes related to the pandemic do you see on the horizon for 2021?
With Joe Biden coming into office, and we'll see what happens with the Senate, but with Joe Biden coming into office, I think we can anticipate some type of additional legislation that looks similar to what we saw in March of April of last year. So at the beginning of the pandemic, Congress passed various legislation that gave employees certain additional paid sick leave beyond what was required previously, as well as enhanced or expanded rather eligibility for the FMLA in some circumstances. Those provisions are set to expire December 31st of this year. So with the pandemic continuing at this point, I think it is likely Congress will, at a minimum, extend that to some point in time next year, if not beyond, and potentially even add to it. I would say if the Democrats win the Senate, and I'm not trying to get political, I'm just kind of reading the tea leaves based on how parties typically pass legislation and what they include in it. If the Democrats get the Senate and Joe Biden is in the White House, I think we can anticipate expanded leave benefits, potentially expanded pay requirements for employees who are off for COVID infection or school closures. I think school closures is a big one. A lot of schools have started to close again in the last few months. So I think we can anticipate that there will be new leave and leave pay laws being enacted early next year, depending on how the Senate shakes out. But again, even if Republicans hold the Senate, I do think we'll see something at a minimum extending the prior legislation that was passed at the beginning of the pandemic this time.
So we recently published an article in the PRO Act. I know a lot of people are talking about that. What should companies be doing right now that will better prepare them for any of these potential coming changes next year?
Yeah, the PRO Act, that's a big one from an employer's perspective, right? I mean, there's a lot of stuff in the PRO Act. And if our listeners aren't familiar with it, they should definitely read your piece. I'm sure it has a great summary of it. But just in broad strokes, it would do a whole lot of things to labor relations. It would make right-to-work laws unlawful. It would allow card check for union recognition, meaning you wouldn't have secret ballot elections anymore. If enough employees signed authorization cards, you might automatically have to recognize them as a union. And there's a whole lot of stuff in the PRO Act that I think is problematic. So for employers who are concerned about that, I think the best thing companies can do is to get out in front of employee relations and make sure you are doing things like recognition for hard work at the company, communicating with employees about how they're doing from a job performance perspective, the state of the business. I can't stress enough how important that is. I think if you can get out in front of employee relations, develop a strong culture, and have employees realize they're not going to be better off with a third party coming in, that's going to put you in a better spot, the best spot possible, regardless if you have the PRO Act or not. You can't lose an election you never had. That's always our mantra.
Mm-hmm. So on that proactive note, I know that Barnes and Thornburg has been offering weekly webinars and other updates to help companies deal with the challenges that have come with COVID-19. Are you guys thinking of continuing to offer those into the new year?
Absolutely. Yeah. We were doing them weekly. Right now, we've recently scaled them back to, I think, bi-weekly. But I think as the new year hits and more legislation's coming out, they'll go back to weekly. But we have labor and employment practitioners covering ADA, FMLA, wage and hour, labor relations, all the different aspects of COVID-19 and the legal implications stemming from it, and a weekly update call. So we have, at any given time, about 8 people participating in that call from a bunch of different disciplines, with focuses on different areas to make sure we're covering the issues that are on employers' minds that continue to stem from COVID.
Excellent. So honestly, your insight and the content that you produce and share on LinkedIn is fantastic. How can the Project HR listeners find out more about you and your work?
Well, thank you so much for the kind words. So if they want to find me, I do, as you just said, I post a lot of content. I publish a blog post almost weekly. I try to get at least one post up weekly on relevant labor and employment topics. Probably the best way to track me is on LinkedIn. I have a pretty unique last name. So my first name is David, last name Pryzbylski, which is P as in Paul, R, Y, Z as in zebra, B as in boy, Y, L-S-K-I. So if you go on and look for David Pryzbylski, I am on LinkedIn. Now, my dad has the same name as me, so just look for the David Pryzbylski, the better looking one, at Barnes and Thornburg, and you can find me on LinkedIn. You can also go to our website, B as in boy, T as in Thomas, LAW.com. That's btlaw.com. Our labor relations blog, our wage and hour and employment practices blog, and a lot of other legal resources, as well as my biography page, can be found on our website as well.
Great stuff. Love that. And I want to make a note to our listeners that we do all the hard work for you, and we listen back to the episode and provide you with a robust and actionable episode companion guide. And this week's companion guide will, of course, include a link to Barnes and Thornburg's website, as well as all of David's contact information and LinkedIn. And to get your copy of that, you can just go to projectionsinc.com/podcast. Right now, though, David, it is time for our lightning round questions. And these are questions we ask of every guest of the podcast. Are you ready for this?
I'm ready.
All right. So our first question is a topic showdown. In this episode, we've been talking about changes in the law due to the pandemic. And as a lawyer, in your opinion, which is the better television show about lawyers, Suits or Law and Order?
This is kind of funny, but I've never actually seen either show, and probably Law and Order is the one that's more difficult to believe, given it's been on TV for a very long period. Mm-hmm. If you're going to ask me about a lawyer show, I'm a really big fan of Goliath on Prime. Particularly the first season, I thought they did a very good job of what the legal process can look like on an expedited basis, but I thought that was a pretty good depiction.
Yeah, I enjoyed that show tremendously. So tell me, what is the best book that you've read recently?
Nothing Like It in the World. It was an account of the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad from east to west and where they met in the middle in America by Stephen Ambrose. It was an excellent read, very fascinating. I'm a big history buff, but I thought that was a pretty great read.
Yeah, sounds like a really good one. So tell me, what's your favorite thing about being a labor and employment attorney?
So for me, it's the people. I mean, I've truly gotten to travel all across the country. All the different people I've met, getting to know them and the different industries and markets they're in has been an absolute thrill, and it's always a good time.
Love that. Love that. What's the best piece of advice that you've ever been given? Work
hard, play harder. And that's from my dad. So I like to work hard, but I think balance is important. And these days, play harder usually involves my kids. They're a lot of fun. I got 2 boys, 5 and 7. But work hard, play harder is a great mantra to live by. I think it's important to make sure that as hard as we work, as hard as we're all working, we need to make sure we find some time to do the things we love.
Sounds like your dad's a smart man. Might lead into my next question, which is who or what inspires you?
Yeah, his head's going to get too big. I'm probably not going to send him a link to the podcast. But my dad definitely inspires me. So he actually was drafted to Vietnam, stayed for an extra tour. He has 3 brothers, and he stayed so none of his other brothers would go. And then he came back, went to college on the GI Bill. He was the first person in his family to ever go to college. Took off for 2 years to scrub blast furnaces at U.S. Steel to save up some money to go to law school, and then came out and went to labor relations. So, as I look at him, professionally, a lot of what I do now mirrors some of what he used to do when he was still working, but just on a personal level as well. It's the hardest working person I ever met, salt of the earth, just a great guy. He's a great person to be a mentor to me growing up, and he's really inspired me to do what I do.
And if you don't send him the link to this podcast, I will. Thanks so much for joining me today on this week's episode of Project HR, David.
Thank you, Jennifer.
And I also want to thank our fantastic listeners. Don't forget to head over to projectionsinc.com/podcast. Get your free episode companion for this episode. If you'd like to be on Project HR, or you know someone who would, just email us at projecthr@projectionsinc.com. And last, but certainly not least, make sure that you never miss an episode of Project HR by subscribing to the podcast at projectionsinc.com/podcast. Drop us a line, leave us a review, or simply give us a handful of stars wherever you get your content. That's it from me for now. Let's make it a great day at work.